36 candles were still smoking on a sheet cake when my mother set her glass down hard enough to quiet the room and announced, in front of 40 people, that I owed her $25,000. Not happy birthday. Not even hello, really. Marjorie Royce walked into the workshop where my friends had strung up paper lanterns and balloons, scanned the spread of food and the banner with my name on it, and decided the best gift she could give her only daughter on her birthday was a bill for her brother's gambling debt. "Family doesn't let family drown, Della," she said loud, working the room with her eyes the way she always did, making sure the audience was watching. "Your brother is in trouble, real trouble, and here you are throwing a party." My father stood behind her, arms folded, doing the silent backup he'd done my whole life. Hollis Royce never threw the punch. He just blocked the exits. 40 faces turned toward me. Tess, who'd organized the whole thing, froze with a stack of plates in her hands. Sal, my old boss, 78 years old and leaning on his cane near the bandsaw, narrowed his eyes the way he used to when a young carpenter measured wrong. Here's the thing my parents didn't know, the thing that makes this one of my favorite stories to tell even now. 20 feet from where my mother stood demanding money, tucked inside a drawer of the workbench I built with my own hands, was a plain manila folder. And everything inside that folder had been signed, 2 years earlier, by the very people now trying to shake me down at my own party. They'd held the pen themselves. They just never bothered to read what they were signing. What that signature triggered was about to turn their whole little performance inside out. Before I take you through it, do me a quick favor, because this story is going to need a witness. If you've ever been the responsible one in a family that only calls when something's on fire, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop a word in the comments telling me the role you got stuck playing growing up. The fixer, the scapegoat, the backup plan. I want to hear yours. I read them all, and trust me, you are not as alone as that family made you feel. Now let's back all the way up, because a folder doesn't just appear in a drawer. You have to know what it cost to put it there. Growing up in Harwick, Michigan, a furniture town an hour outside Grand Rapids, there were two kinds of Royce children, and everybody knew which was which. Devin was the bright one. Charming, quick, the kind of kid who could talk a teacher out of a detention and into a recommendation letter. And then there was me, the one who couldn't read a paragraph out loud without the words sliding around like spilled marbles. Nobody used the word dyslexia in our house. They used lazy. They used not college material. They used, well, Della's more of a hands kid, said with a little laugh, like having hands was a consolation prize. School was a daily humiliation. Mr. Calloway, my 8th grade English teacher, once read my essay out loud to demonstrate what poor writing looked like, my misspellings and all, while the class laughed and I studied the grain of my desk so hard I could have drawn it from memory. He held the paper up like evidence. "This," he told the room, "is what happens when you don't try." Trying was all I did. I'd spent 6 hours on that essay, sounding out every word, and it still came out looking like a ransom note. Funny, looking back. Studying that grain might have been the first real woodworking I ever did. Home was the same story in a different room. One Christmas stands out, the year I was 10 and Devin was 13. Under the tree, Devin got a brand new bike, the expensive kind with the gears, plus a video game console, plus a watch. Wrapped in the corner with my name on it was a single box. Inside was a set of secondhand hand tools, a chisel with someone else's initials burned into the handle, a coping saw with a little rust on the blade. My mother watched me open it and said, "We thought you'd like something practical, since you're not really a school person." She meant it as a small cruelty, a way to rank her children right there on the living room floor. What she didn't understand, what she never understood, was that she'd just handed me the only Christmas gift I'd remember for the rest of my life. I still have that rusty coping saw. It hangs above my workbench. The bike's been in a landfill for 20 years. The only place the marbles held still was the shop building behind the school. Wood didn't care if you could spell. A board was either square or it wasn't. And your hands either knew it or they didn't, and mine, it turned out, knew. By 15, I was building furniture that grown men paid for. By 16, I'd been taken under the wing of Salvatore Marchetti, an old cabinet maker with a shop on Cooper Street, hands like tree roots, an accent he never lost, and zero patience for self-pity. "You think you are stupid," Sal told me once, watching me cut a perfect dovetail joint, the kind most people need a jig to manage. "Look at this. Stupid people cannot do this." They told you the wrong word for what you are. The word is not stupid. The word is uncommon. Working for Sal was the first time anyone had ever expected something of me and been right to. He paid me $4 an hour to start, which he raised the day I sharpened a plane blade well enough that he couldn't find a flaw in the edge. He didn't believe in praise that wasn't earned, which meant the rare time he gave it, you felt it in your chest for a week. The shop smelled like cut cherry and hot motor and the particular sweetness of beeswax finish. And to this day, that smell does more for my nerves than anything a doctor could prescribe. He taught me by handing me real work and letting me fail on it where it didn't matter. My first solo project was a step stool for a customer's kitchen. I built it twice. The first one wobbled, one leg a 1/16 of an inch short, and Sal made me take a handsaw to it in front of him, dismantle the thing I'd sweated over, and start again. "A wobble is a lie," he said. "The customer trusts the thing to hold them. You do not get to lie to a person who trusts you to hold them." I think about that line more than almost anything else he ever said. It turned out to be about a lot more than furniture. By the time I was 17, customers were asking for me by name. A woman came in wanting a hope chest for her daughter's wedding, and Sal, who could have taken the commission himself, looked at me and said, "Ask Della. It is her hands you want." I built that chest out of quarter-sawn white oak with a hidden compartment in the base, because a girl getting married deserves a place to keep the things she doesn't tell anyone. The woman cried when she saw it, 17 years old, and I'd already learned the thing my whole family never did, that the work you do with care becomes a kind of love that outlasts you. Sal gave me the second half of my childhood. The first half had belonged to Devin. Every dollar that came into the Royce house seemed to find its way to my brother. Devin needed cleats, Devin needed a tutor, Devin needed a car so he could find himself after he dropped out of his second college. Meanwhile, I worked weekends at Sal's shop and handed half my pay to my mother for rent at 16 in the house I'd grown up in. Nobody charged Devin rent. Devin lived rent-free until he was 26. Leaving wasn't dramatic. No door, no snow, no big scene. The summer I turned 19, I'd saved enough to put a deposit on a tiny storefront 2 towns over, and one Tuesday I just loaded my tools into a borrowed van and went. My mother's only comment, as I carried the last box out, was to ask whether I'd thought about how this looks, how it looked, not whether I'd be all right, whether the neighbors would think the Royces couldn't keep their daughter home. That first storefront was a former bait shop with a slab floor and a heater that worked when it felt like it. Winters, I wore fingerless gloves to sand. The rent was $400 a month, and some months that $400 might as well have been $4,000. There was a stretch that first year, deep in February, when I had $11 in my checking account and a customer who wouldn't pay until the job was done, and a job that needed lumber I couldn't afford to buy. Sat on an overturned bucket in that cold shop and seriously thought about calling my parents, swallowing my pride, asking for help. Didn't make the call. Instead, I went to the lumber yard, explained my situation to the old man who ran it, and asked if he'd float me the wood until the job closed. He looked at me a long moment, this teenager with sawdust in her hair, and said, "Marchetti trained you?" When I nodded, he said, "Then your word's good enough for me. Pay me when you're paid." That's how reputations work in a trade. Sal's name carried me across a gap my own family wouldn't have lifted a finger to close. The job closed. I paid the lumberyard the same afternoon the check cleared, in cash, with a thank you. And I learned the lesson that built everything after, that the people who help you are almost never the people who are supposed to. And the trick of a good life is to notice the difference and pay it forward to the next teenager on the next overturned bucket. What I built over the next 15 years, I built one cabinet at a time. The storefront became a real shop. The real shop became a name people in 3 counties trusted. Royce Woodworks. Custom cabinetry, built-ins, the kind of staircases that make people stop on their way up just to run a hand along the rail. By 36, the year of the cake and the candles, there were 11 people on my payroll and a waiting list 6 months long. I'd built it the way Sal taught me, slow, square, and honest, no shortcut that wouldn't hold weight. The job that put me on the map came when I was 28, a full staircase for a restored Victorian a wealthy couple was bringing back to life. 18 feet of curved black walnut, hand-railed. With balusters, I turned myself, each one identical, each one true. Took 4 months. The night I set the final newel post, I stood at the bottom of those stairs alone in an empty house and ran my hand all the way up the rail, feeling for the one spot that wasn't smooth, and there wasn't one. That staircase got photographed for a magazine. The phone didn't stop for a year. I hired my first employee that spring, a quiet kid named Marcus who couldn't sit still in a classroom but could read a grain like scripture. Felt like passing something on. My family noticed exactly none of it, until the day they noticed all of it at once, which is the day the word got around that Della had money. Because here is what nobody tells you about being the forgotten child who quietly does well. The forgetting only lasts until you're useful. Devon's troubles had been building for years, the way water builds behind a clogged drain. The bar was the big one. He'd opened a place downtown called Royce's, using my family name on the sign without asking me. Financed by a chunk of my parents' retirement, they swore they'd get back tenfold. Devon threw a grand opening with a band and an ice sculpture and free drinks for half the county. For about 6 months, he was the toast of Harwick, buying rounds, calling himself an entrepreneur. Then the supplier invoices came due, and the liquor license fees, and the rent he'd lowballed in his projections, and it turned out my brother had spent more on the ice sculpture than on a single hour of learning how to run a business. The bar closed inside a year. My parents never saw a dollar of that retirement again. And the lesson they took from it was not stop giving Devon money. The lesson they took was we need to find more money for Devon. Add to the bar a business opportunity that was mostly a man named Rick and a lot of promises. Add sports betting on his phone, the new kind. The kind that lives in your pocket and never sleeps. By the time he was 33, my brother owed money to people who do not send polite letters. The first real ambush came 2 years before the birthday. My parents drove the hour to my shop, which they had never once visited to see my work, and sat across from me at the reclaimed oak table I'd made for the showroom. My mother ran her finger along the edge of that table without seeming to notice it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever touched. Devon came too, hanging back by the door, charming and sheepish, doing the little half-smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 6. My mother cried, real tears, or the kind she could summon. I've never been sure there's a difference with her. My father stared at the wall where I'd hung a framed photo of that walnut staircase, and I watched him look at it and look away, like the proof of me was a glare he couldn't stand. The conversation circled for 20 minutes before it landed. All, we're worried sick, and you don't understand the pressure he's under. Devon chimed in once to say the debt wasn't really his fault, that the market had turned, that his partner Rick had played him. And the ask, when it finally came, was for me to co-sign a $25,000 consolidation loan to get Devon back on his feet. Just your signature, my mother said. Like a signature was nothing. Like she hadn't spent my whole childhood teaching me that my name was worth less than my brother's. You have good credit. It's just a formality. Family helps family. Co-sign. Put my name, my business, my 15 years on the line for a man who'd never once put anything on the line for me. Saying no to your crying mother is one of the hardest things a person can do. But Sal had taught me something besides joinery. He'd taught me that you never, ever sign your name to a thing you haven't read, and you never sign for work you can't control. Devon was work I couldn't control. So I said no to the cosign. What I said yes to was smaller and smarter. A one-time gift, $6,000, no strings, to help with the most urgent part, on one condition. Everyone signs a piece of paper first. My mother actually laughed. Paper? We're family. What do we need paper for? We need paper, I told her. Precisely because we're family. My attorney, a sharp, calm woman named Priya Raman, drafted a single page in plain language. When I called her, she asked me one question that told me I'd picked the right lawyer. Do you want this to feel nice, or do you want it to hold? Hold, I told her. Always hold. Sal would have liked her. The page said 3 things. The $6,000 was a gift, given once and final. I bore no responsibility, then or ever, for any of Devon's debts. And my parents acknowledged, in writing, that any loan they chose to personally guarantee for Devon was theirs and theirs alone, fully their responsibility, with no claim against me. They signed it in my showroom, irritated, rushing through it, my mother muttering about how cold I'd become. Devon signed it too, with a flourish, barely reading, already mentally spending the $6,000. Hollis signed last, pressing so hard with the pen that he tore the paper a little at the bottom. That torn page went into a manila folder. The folder went into a drawer in my workbench, and for 2 years, I honestly thought I'd never need it. There were nights, during those 2 years, when I'd open that drawer for a tape measure or a pencil and see the corner of the folder sitting there and feel a small twist of something I couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, for not trusting my own parents. Sadness that trust was a thing I'd had to replace with paperwork. A woman shouldn't need a signed contract to be safe from her own mother. But Sal's voice always settled it. A wobble is a lie, and the customer trusts the thing to hold them. I'd built my whole life so it would hold weight. The folder was just one more joint, cut true, tucked out of sight, doing nothing at all until the day the load came down on it. The best work is like that. You don't notice it until the moment it saves you. Here's the part my parents walked right past in their hurry to grab the money. The paper didn't just protect me. It documented, in their own handwriting, that they understood the danger of guaranteeing Devon's debts. I'd practically drawn them a map of the cliff. And then, 6 months later, against every word on that page, they went and did the exact thing it warned them about. They co-signed a fresh $25,000 loan for Devon, put their own house up as collateral to get him a better rate, signed their names right on the line marked guarantor. Their signature is what triggered everything that followed. They just didn't know it yet. How did I find out they'd co-signed, you might ask, if we weren't speaking? Harwick, a town where the lumberyard, the bank, and the diner all share the same 6 families and the same long memory. The loan officer who processed it was a man whose daughter I'd built a nursery for. He didn't tell me anything confidential, nothing he shouldn't have. He just said, "The next time I came in for hardware, saw your folks in last week. Brave thing, putting the Bellamy house up like that at their age. I went still in the middle of that aisle, a box of cabinet hinges in my hand, and understood in one cold rush that they'd taken the very cliff I'd drawn them a map of and walked off it holding hands. For Devon, always for Devon. I could have called them, warned them again, begged them to refinance before it was too late. But I'd learned something on that overturned bucket 15 years before. You cannot save people from a fall they are determined to take. All you can do is make sure you're not standing underneath them when they land." For a while, things were quiet. Devon made a few payments, posted photos of himself looking reformed, talked about a new business that was going to change everything. My parents bragged. The prodigal son was prodigaling again. Then Devon stopped paying. Then Devon stopped answering. Last anyone heard, he was somewhere in Arizona, or maybe Nevada, the geography of a man following the next sure thing. And the lender, holding a loan with 2 co-signers who owned a house, did exactly what lenders do. They turned to the people whose signatures were on the line. My parents. Foreclosure notices have a particular weight to them. My mother, who had spent her whole life worried about how things looked, suddenly faced the most public humiliation Harwick could offer, losing the house on Bellamy Street in front of everyone she'd ever competed with at church. And that, finally, is when they remembered they had a daughter. The phone calls started a month before my birthday. I let most of them go to voicemail. "Della, we need to talk. Della, this is your family. Della, your brother could go to prison." The voicemails climbed a ladder from sweet to sad to furious, sometimes all 3 in 90 seconds. One I saved, played it more than once, the way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. My mother's voice, sugar on top, steel underneath. "Della, honey, I know we haven't always been the perfect parents, but we did our best. And a daughter who turns her back on her family when they're down, well, that's not how I raised you, how she raised me." The audacity of that line nearly knocked me off my stool. She'd raised me to hand over half my paycheck at 16 and call it rent. She'd raised me to believe my hands were a consolation prize. The only thing about me she hadn't raised was the part that finally said no. And that part I'd built myself, out in the cold, on an overturned bucket. with a lumberyard owner's trust and an old Italian's voice in my head. What I didn't do was call back with a yes. And here's why. Because this matters more than any clever twist. I'd spent 34 years auditioning for a love that was never going to be cast my way. Somewhere in my 30s, in the quiet of a shop that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, I'd finally stopped auditioning. You can't be guilted by people whose approval you've stopped chasing. That's the real superpower, and it's available to anyone, and it's free. When voicemails didn't work, my mother decided on a different stage. My birthday party. Public. 40 witnesses. Maximum pressure. She figured I'd never make a scene in front of my friends, that I'd write a check just to make the embarrassment stop. She figured wrong, because the embarrassment she was about to feel was not going to be mine. So there we were, smoking candles, frozen friends, my mother's glass ringing against the table, $25,000 demanded in front of everyone I cared about. You should understand what that party was, to understand what she walked into and tried to wreck. Tess had spent 2 weeks planning it. She'd strung those paper lanterns across the rafters of my own workshop, cleared the floor where the table saw usually sat, and invited the people who'd actually shown up for me across 15 years. Marcus and the other apprentices, the lumberyard families, old customers who'd become friends. Sal, who almost never left his house anymore, had let his nephew drive him over because, he said, "You do not miss the birthday of someone you are proud of." There was a banner with my name spelled right and a cake Tess had made herself. I realized somewhere in the middle of it, the first birthday party anyone had thrown for me in my entire life. My family had never once managed a cake. And into that, the one warm room I'd built for myself out of nothing, my mother walked with a bill. For a moment, the old reflex flickered. The scared kid who studied the grain of her desk wanted to make it stop, wanted to apologize for existing, wanted to write the check just so my real family, the chosen one, wouldn't have to watch. That kid lives in all of us, the ones who were trained young to keep the peace at our own expense. But the woman who'd built Royce Woodworks set down her own glass, wiped her hands on a shop towel, and walked the 20 feet to the workbench. 40 people watched me slide open the drawer, watched me lift out a plain manila folder, soft at the corners from 2 years of waiting. "You want to talk about money in front of everyone, Mom?" My voice came out steadier than I'd ever heard it. "Let's talk about money in front of everyone." I opened the folder. The first page I held up was the agreement. Their signatures, my mother's neat cursive, my father's torn pressure mark, Devon's careless flourish. I read it out loud, slowly, the way Mr. Calloway once read my essay, except this time the words held perfectly still. "This says I'm not responsible for Devon's debts. You signed that, both of you, 2 years ago, in my showroom." My mother's face started to change. "And this part?" My finger moved down the page. "This is where you acknowledged, in writing, that any loan you personally guaranteed for Devon was your responsibility, not mine. You initialed it, right here." The second page was the one that emptied the room of air. A copy of the loan they'd co-signed. Their names on the guarantor line, plain as a brand. I'd had Priya pull it after the foreclosure notices became public record. Because public record is public record. And I read paper for a reason now. "6 months after you signed my agreement," I said, "you went and signed this. You put the house on Bellamy up as collateral for Devon. Nobody made you. I told you not to, in writing, and you did it anyway, because you would burn your own roof down before you'd ever tell Devon no." Hollis sat down heavily in a folding chair. My mother had stopped performing for the room. She was just looking at the paper. "That signature," I said, and I tapped the guarantor line, "is what triggered all of this. Not me, not my party, that pen. The lender isn't coming for me, because my name isn't on anything except a page that says I'm clear. The lender is coming for you. The $25,000 you just demanded from me, you don't get to collect it from your daughter. You owe it. You triggered it. And no amount of doing this in front of my friends changes whose handwriting is on the line." You could have heard a wood shaving drop. Tess set down her stack of plates. Sal, over by the bandsaw, did something I'd only seen him do a handful of times in 20 years. He smiled. Just a little, just at the corner, the smile of an old craftsman watching a joint come together exactly true. One of my employees, Marcus, quietly moved to stand near me, not saying anything, just there, the way you stand near someone so they know which side you're on. My mother looked around the room for an ally and found 40 people studying their shoes. I won't pretend a part of me didn't savor it. After a lifetime of being read out loud as the cautionary tale, getting to be the one holding the page, reading it back, watching them finally hear the words, that was a kind of justice that doesn't have a price tag. But here is where the story splits from the kind of revenge that leaves you as empty as the people who hurt you. Because I didn't stop at the part that felt good. I had one more thing in that folder, and it was the part Sal would have been proud of. The third page was a printout. An open, paid enrollment slot at a real debt recovery and job training program 2 hours south. One I'd quietly looked into and reserved the year before, back when I first saw where Devin was heading. A spot with his name on it. Counseling, a structured payment plan, an actual paycheck doing actual work. This is for Devin, I told them, setting it on the table. Not money, a door. Funded by me, paid directly to the program, never a dollar through your hands or his. If he wants to climb out, the ladder's already bought and waiting, but he has to walk to it himself. Nobody's carrying him anymore. Not you, and definitely not me. My mother opened her mouth, and for once nothing useful came out. And the house, I said, gentler now, because the gentleness was for me, not for them. I'm not paying that loan, that's yours. But I know a good attorney who can help you fight the foreclosure terms, and I'll cover her first consultation. 1. After that, you're adults who signed your names, and adults who sign their names live with their signatures. That's the whole lesson, really. The only one this family ever needed. Then I picked up the cake knife, cut the first slice of my own birthday cake, and carried it across the room to Sal. He took it with both shaking hands. Uncommon girl, he said, just for me, and that was worth more than any check I could have written. My parents let themselves out somewhere in there. Nobody walked them to the door. The party, after a stunned minute, simply closed back over the space where they'd stood, the way water closes over a dropped stone, and Tess put on music. And we ate cake in a workshop that smelled like sawdust and candle smoke, and it remains, to this day, the best birthday of my life. Word travels in a furniture town the way wood drinks stain, slow, and then all at once. By the next week, the whole story had made its rounds. Scrubbed and re-scrubbed at the diner and the lumberyard and the church my mother had spent 30 years performing in. And the town's verdict surprised even me. People I barely knew started telling me their own versions. A man at the hardware store said his sister had bled him dry for a decade before he learned to say no. A woman who'd bought a kitchen island from me confessed she'd co-signed a car for a nephew and was still paying it off, 6 years later, alone. The lumberyard owner, the same one who'd floated me wood at 19, now white-haired and slower, leaned over the counter and told me his own brother had done the same kind of thing to their parents back in the 70s, and that watching me stand my ground had unknotted something in his chest he'd carried for 50 years. Turns out half of Harwick was carrying someone else's signature on their back. My story just gave them permission to set theirs down. What got back to me, eventually, was that my mother had tried to tell her version at church first, the ungrateful daughter version she'd been rehearsing for years. But the thing about doing your damage in public is that the public remembers. Too many people had watched me grow up handing over half my paycheck. Too many had bought my work and knew what it was worth. Her story didn't take. For the first time in her life, Marjorie Royce stood in a room and found that the room believed me instead of her. Mr. Calloway, my old English teacher, came into the showroom one afternoon, older and smaller than the giant I remembered, leaning on the arm of his grown grandson. He'd heard, the way everyone had heard. He moved slowly through the showroom, stopping at a bookcase I'd built from figured maple, and he ran his hand along the top shelf the way you touch something you're afraid to break. I had a student once, he said, not quite looking at me, who I thought wasn't trying. I read her work out loud to the class. I've thought about that more than once over the years. He paused a long time. I was looking at the wrong thing. I was grading the spelling and missing the mind. He turned and looked at me then, this man who'd handed me my worst memory of childhood. You build beautiful things, Della. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what kind of smart you were. People don't usually get the apology they spent childhood wanting. Most of us carry the unpaid debt of it to the grave. Getting that one, in my own showroom, surrounded by the proof of everything they said I'd never do, closed a door I'd been leaning against for 25 years. I sold him that bookcase at cost, and I delivered it myself, and we never spoke of it again, which was exactly right. Sal had a stroke that fall and spent his last weeks in a care home with a window that looked out on nothing much, a parking lot and a strip of gray sky. I brought wood scraps to his room so he'd have something to hold, blocks of cherry and walnut he could turn over in those hands like tree roots even when the words had mostly left him. Some evenings we didn't talk at all. I'd just sand something quietly in the corner while he dozed, and the sound of it seemed to ease him, the way it had always eased me. I sat with him most evenings. The day before he passed, he gripped mine and said, in that accent he never lost, "You did good, uncommon girl. You built things that hold." Then he closed his eyes. Those were the last words he ever said to me, and I've decided they're the only review of my life I'll ever need. He left me his shop on Cooper Street, the one where he'd first told me the right word for what I was. There was a note with the deed, 3 lines in his careful old-world hand. "The shop is yours. Fill it with the ones they call lazy. They are not lazy. They are waiting for someone to hand them the right tool." I knocked out a wall, doubled the workspace, and hung a sign that takes apprentices now, the ones the schools have written off, the hands kids, the marble-eyed readers, the uncommon ones. 3 of them work for me full-time today. One of them just built her first staircase. Devin, in case you're wondering, took 2 months to call the program. 2 months of silence while my parents scrambled with the foreclosure they'd signed themselves into. 2 months of him surely waiting for someone to swoop in the way someone always had. Nobody swooped. That was the new part. For 33 years, there'd been a net under my brother, woven out of my parents' fear and my own guilt, and for the first time in his life, he looked down and the net was gone. He called me once during those 2 months, late, his voice doing the charming thing, testing whether the old machine still worked. "Come on, Della. You really gonna let your own brother sink over 25 grand you could cover with a Tuesday?" And I told him the truest thing I know. "I'm not letting you sink, Devin. I bought you a boat. It's parked at a program 2 hours south with your name on it. You just have to row it yourself. That's the only version of help I have left." He hung up on me. But he did, eventually, call the program. Last I heard, he was 18 months in, working a real job, paying down what was his to pay. We're not close. We may never be. But a door held open is sometimes all you can honestly offer a person, and what they do with it is the one signature that's truly theirs. My parents and I exist now in a careful, quiet peace. They kept the house, barely, on terms they'll be paying off into their 80s. They have never apologized, not in words. But my mother sends a card on my birthday now, every year, and inside, in that neat cursive, she writes, "Happy birthday," and nothing else. From Marjorie Royce, those 2 words are practically a symphony. I take them for exactly what they are. One last thought to carry with you out of all this, and then I'll let you get back to your day. Pay attention to whose name is on what. Every guilt trip, every family helps family, every late-night demand dressed up as love, comes down to a simple question that people will work very hard to keep you from asking. Whose signature is actually on the line? Be slow to put yours on anything. Be slower still to let someone else's debt become your name to carry. You are allowed to love people and still refuse to sign for them. The kindest, strongest thing you can build is a life where your name only appears on the things you actually chose. If this story landed somewhere real for you, the best thing you can do right now is tap subscribe, because every week I sit down and tell another true-to-life story about ordinary people who got underestimated and learned to stand square anyway. And I'd genuinely hate for you to miss the next one. And before you go, settle one thing for me down in the comments. If your family handed you a bill tomorrow for simply existing, what would you write back on it? Give me your best line. I'll be down there reading every single one, and I might just read a few of yours out loud next time.